The question everybody wants the answer to. How many HBCU players get drafted in this year's NFL draft? Well, if you ask me, I'd say
you are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor. Thank you for going on this journey with me, making Locked On HBCU your first listen of the day every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. It just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. You see it right there at the bottom of the screen. But if you don't, that means you're on the audio side of things and you are still appreciated. Just don't forget the S on the end of South Exclusives. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to make every moment more. And today's episode is completely centered around the big time question that we need to answer, and we'll have the answer to it on Saturday, at the end of Saturday. But I hope you liked my little cliffhanger, but I'm not going to leave you hanging. We're going to break this into three categories of players. But before we do any of that, let's answer the question off the rip. How many HBCU players will be drafted in this year's 2023 NFL draft? I rubbed my crystal ball, aka my microphone, but just doing it on the air so the audio listeners don't have to hear the scratches and scratches. And my crystal ball says we have 5 with a possible bump to 6. Yep, that's what it says, a possible bump to 6. And let's treat it like spades. I got 5 and a possible, right? Because there's 5 players who, whether I feel confident they're going to be drafted or I just think they're going to be drafted, and there's one room for a little extra. Now, I think I'm a little bit more optimistic. From what I've seen, I don't think many people believe we're going to see a bump in amount of players that are drafted this year, but I do. Last season or last draft, we had 4. And this year, I think we're going to see 5 with a possible bump to 6, 7. But let's just not go too far. My prediction is 5. And if we get to 6, I was still right. But if we go over that or we're under 5, I wasn't right. I can't give myself too much room. I want to give a confident prediction, not just kind of straddle the fence, okay? So the first category is players that I have a lot of confidence will get drafted. I'm going to say full confidence, because you'll see in the segment 2 why there's a reason for a distinction between full confidence and really confident. And I want to be clear. I'm going on what I think will happen. This isn't about what I think should happen. If there was 32 different variants, right? I'm a comic guy. So if there was 32 different variants of Darian Gray, the Mouth of the South, all the different nicknames I've ever created in my life, and I've created quite a bit, might not reach 32, but I've created quite a bit. If it was a different versions of me that were coming in here and they were picking for 7 rounds, 250 something picks, if you put the comp picks and everything in there, what would I do? This isn't that. This is based off of rumblings and interest and things that I've seen and heard and all of the things in between, because I'm not just listing desires. I'm listing predictions. So that's a very important distinction when having this conversation. This is distinctions over desires. Or excuse me, this is predictions over desires. So let's move into the players that I am confident will be drafted. And it's just 3. Just 3 guys. It's Mark Evans, Isaiah Land, and Aubrey Miller. That's the big 3. When you think about it, if you just reflect for a second, even if you have to pause me to do it after I tell you what to reflect about, if you just think back to the whole offseason, who are the 3 names who are on the tip of everybody's tongue? Who are the 3 HBCU names who are right there on Front Street? And it's been that way for a while. You could say Aubrey Miller and Isaiah Land because they were at the Senior Bowl. But I think that if Mark Evans played any other position, he would also be on the front of your mind. It's just the fact that he plays offensive line. Offensive line is just not a position that you really think about all the time. But when you look at the conversations and the people who have been put up to the front, These were the three that I consistently seen named over the last year span. I'm talking about since last draft. These are people who have been around, people I have predicted and have been expecting to have really good senior seasons, people I expected to be draft prospects, and they did not disappoint. These are the only three players that I feel like I can have full confidence in saying are going to be drafted in 2023. UAPB's Mark Evans, FAMU's Isaiah Land, and Jackson State's Aubrey Miller. I'll start off with Evans because, like I said, a lot of people don't just think about offensive linemen, but to me, he has been the most constant HBCU prospect throughout this whole draft process. Did he go to the Senior Bowl? No, and that did surprise me. I really did think he was going to get a Senior Bowl invitation, but he didn't, and despite not having that, he still went to the Shrine Bowl, switched positions from offensive tackle to offensive guard, and he looked good. It was new to him. I'm sure that he had practiced it leading up to it, and it might not be that much of a difference, but there is a difference in playing that position, and I thought he acclimated himself very well. But why do I say he's a constant? Because that would probably sound like he boosted his stock. To me, Mark Evans is a constant because I look at where he was a year ago. A prominent HBCU prospect. I look at where he's at now, a prominent HBCU prospect. And while that might not seem like a positive, there's so many people who in their last season of playing in college, they have their stock fluctuate. Meanwhile, this guy has been a player who was in the conversation for the first HBCU player drafted and still is in the conversation for the first HBCU player drafted. It was never concrete he was number one. It's still not to this day. I still would say he's in the 1 to 3, 1 to 2 mix, but I kind of feel like he might be the guy who's selected first. I'm not putting my stamp on that. I know this is a confident category, but I wouldn't put my stamp on that. But the other guy who I think is probably in that top 2 is Isaiah Land. And remember, we're not ranking prospects. I'm talking about players in the order I think they'll be drafted. But Isaiah Land is a player who I think, I'm such an overthinker, and he's somebody I try not to overthink about, but it's the size. That's simply all it is. If Isaiah Land had no size concerns, I would have the utmost, I might even create another tier for me to say that he would be drafted. But I still have full confidence because I'm trying to get past my overthinking, and I'm looking at the fact that so many teams have still displayed interest. So many teams have shown interest as an off-ball linebacker, as an on-ball linebacker, as a defensive end. We've seen so many different ways that people want to use Isaiah Land. I feel confident, full confidence, that he's going to be drafted in this year's draft. And then the last guy that I'm going to put in this category is Aubrey Miller. And Aubrey Miller, for me, as talented as he is, as the leadership and the intangibles, the energy, the hustle, all of those things are on display every single play, and that's what makes him a great prospect. But the reason I have him in this category, full confidence, is because of the platform that he was able to receive over the last 2 seasons. See, all of those things make him a great prospect, and that's why this platform has benefited him. The Jackson State platform does not make up for deficiencies. Of course, you have people who are great salesmen, and those things can happen. But the Jackson State platform does not make bad players look great. That's not what's happening here. But what it does is it allows great players who might not have seen so much attention now be able to receive the attention. And that's the reason that I think Aubrey Miller, with full confidence, is going to be a draftee. Now, you look at Aubrey Miller, you look at Isaiah Land. I know I didn't touch on them as much as I did Mark Evans. However, I'm going to break them down as the week goes on. We're going to have some player breakdowns, and I'm going to try to put my scout hat on for the first time ever. So you'll be witness to me trying to build a new skill. But going forward, we're going to continue talking about these players. Who else do I think is going to get drafted? Because mind you, I said 5 with a possible bump to 6. We've only named 3. So I have 2 more players that I'm going to list off that I think could be drafted and wouldn't surprise me. However, I don't have full confidence that it's going to happen. Let's break that down as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Before we get into that, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, and FanDuel is the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. The NBA playoffs are in full effect. Only one series is over. We only had one sweep in this whole first round of the playoffs. So there's so many more games that you can put money on. There's so many more opportunities to win. And if you do fail, right? Because not everybody gets it right on the first try. It's okay. I believe in second chances. FanDuel agrees with me. And because of that, they're going to give you the first bet, no sweat, meaning if you're new to this, if you're new to FanDuel, you will get up to $1,000 in free bets if you lose on your first bet. You have the Kings-Warriors series going crazy. Minnesota avoided being swept by the Denver Nuggets this I guess, yes, last night is tonight for me. But last night, by the time that you're able to hear it, there are so many games that you should put your money down on. Celtics, Hawks, oh my God, the Clippers, Suns. What's going on? There's so many games that you can put money down and only one place to do it, and that's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. And as we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked on HBCU, I appreciate you for making us your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you're checking out the great content that we're having on this network. The Locked On Podcast Network has a mock draft special where all of the local hosts get to putting down their selections for their teams. And my guy Ross, he traded back out of the first round. And what did he do with those other picks? You got to go to the NFL mock draft special to find out the answer to that. Now, I want to continue my list. We had players I'm confident are going to be drafted, but now we have players where it wouldn't surprise me. Wouldn't surprise me. I almost expected for some of these guys, right? Because I have 5. I only listed off 3 of the players that I think are going to be drafted. Now, what this means is I still think these players have a really good shot at being drafted. I just can't put full confidence behind them being drafted. That's the only difference between this category and then the category I had just listed off, right? So they're not the big 3, but they're still right there. And Xavier Smith, Isaiah Land's teammate at FAMU, was a player who almost got put in the full confidence category. But the reason he didn't is because I had so much hesitation and I kept going back and forth. And after a while of going back and forth, I realized this is for full confidence. And if I'm hesitating this much, I don't have full confidence. That being said, I do believe that Xavier Smith gets drafted. That's the 4th player on my list. And if you were to ask me, hey, who do you think is going to get drafted? I'd say the big 3. So Evans, Land, Miller, and I would say Smith. And then I would say, I think, with the following player. Here's the thing about Xavier Smith. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Xavier Smith does everything you want. He checks all these boxes. The only thing you can't say he has is the size. That's it. Once you get past that, if you can get past it, you have a player who is an all-conference player in the MEAC and the SWAC. You have a guy who has red zone production. He has touchdowns. He has catches. He has yards. He has yards after the catch. He has sure hands. He has everything that you would want. There's no questioning that Xavier Smith has been a great player for FAMU. The only thing people are questioning is, do I want a player of his size? And clearly, the answer for somebody will be yes. That's the way that I view it, But here's the thing. We're talking middle to late round. And for me, an FCS player with great production is very comparable to an FBS player with low-level production and maybe a certain traits or a certain frame/build that teams feel like they can stack upon. And the reason I say that is because if the trait was exceptional, they'd be a first, second round pick. Because we've seen players with questionable production, but they have a great get off. They have a great frame. They have great speed. And, they're a first round pick or they're an early day 2 pick. But if we're talking middle to late rounds, those guys don't have exceptional traits most times. And it's almost like you're picking at a project. And this really goes for anybody, even though we're talking about Xavier Smith. I like Smith's production. I really do. His size is a question. But in the mid to late rounds, if he's shown his ability to be a return specialist, that's going to go out the window. Size does not limit Xavier Smith from being a good returner. At 5'9", 5'10", you can be a good returner. It's just people are going to question if you can be a wide receiver. But as long as you get out there first, I've seen it firsthand with my Saints twice in the last 3 years. I've seen a small wide receiver from the FCS level be able to be a kick returner and then kind of merge into the offense more. I've seen it with Deontay Hardy, and I've seen it with Rashid Shaheed. So it happens. Trust me on that. The next player that I want to talk about is Jadakis Bonds. And this is the one person I'll say, I think so. I think so. And the only reason I don't have the full confidence that I have, or not even full confidence, but the only reason I say I think before him is because I feel like I haven't heard enough people attached to him. But this is a player who I heard people love earlier in the process. at the Shrine Bowl, right? We talking to Coach Hagans, and he was talking about how people liked Jadakis Bonds. It's just that since then I haven't heard too much, so I can't have the full confidence. But what is there not to like? What is there not to like about Jadakis Bonds? He has the size. He has the ability to get vertical. He has touchdown production. He has, matter of fact, here goes the thing that I love about Jadakis Bonds, maybe over anything else, or this is how I'll say it. This is the trait about Jadakis Bonds. This right here is why I think Jadakis Bonds is going to get a lot of love in the NFL draft. He was able to produce in the CAA. He was able to break a stigma that a lot of HBCU players deal with. Because the MEAC, the SWAC, they're not looked at as the greatest of conferences. See, just like the FBS, the FCS has a hierarchy when it comes to conferences. And I hear the CAA spoken about with great reverence. Maybe not so much when it comes to the Big South. So when Bonds was able to dominate in the Big South, be an all-conference player, that was great. That was one thing. But then when Hampton moves into the Big 12, when Hampton moves into the CAA and he becomes another all-conference player, now that's got everybody's attention. Now that's a factor that people are saying, oh, okay. He's able to do it against some of the better FCS competition. Sign me up for that. And then the last player in this category, but he's actually the first of the players that I'm going to say are possibles, right? Because I have my 5 that I think are going to be drafted. You're looking at Mark Evans, Isaiah Land, Aubrey Miller, Xavier Smith, Jadakis Bonds. Those are my 5 I think are going to be drafted. But Shaq Davis is like that tweener almost, where he's writing a guy who I wouldn't be surprised if he gets drafted. But at the same time, he's just on my possible. Shaq Davis will probably be my simplest breakdown that I could have. He's big and he's fast. As a wide receiver with his size, with true home run threat ability, whether the ball is in his hands or not in his hands already. You know he has breakaway speed, or he can just beat you over the top. This is somebody whose frame and size, his frame and speed is going to attract somebody. If he's not a late round draft pick, I think he can be a priority undrafted free agent. This is a player who I think people are going to be extremely high on, right? And I know that they know him. I know that scouts know Shaq Davis, because how did Davis burst onto the scene? In the last season's Celebration Bowl, and he was going against Jackson State in Deion Sanders' first full season, fall season, because I really don't count the spring. In the first season, he goes against Deion Sanders in the biggest game of the year, the HBCU Super Bowl. And there's mad team personnel who don't even care about HBCU football, but they care about Deion, and they just want to check to see what he was doing. Oh, he's in the HBCU Super Bowl. Let's see what Deion Sanders is doing. He got tore up. And a big part of that was the fact that Shaq Davis had 3 touchdowns doing the primetime shuffle in the end zone. So, yeah, I think they know who Shaq Davis is. I think they know about that South Carolina State wide receiver. They probably thinking, dang, I thought they just did defense over there in South Carolina State. We're going to have to pay attention to who this guy is. Did they follow through? I don't know. I don't know if they followed through. But I will say that Davis, the player, commanded enough attention to where at least some, they didn't all just abandon Davis, at least some followed up and seen what he was able to do in his last year with the Bulldogs. And Davis is the leading candidate when it comes to my possibles, right? I know he's in the I wouldn't be surprised category, and we're going to have more people after him. But if I had to guess who would be that 6th player, it would be Shaq Davis, simply because of his size and his speed. Now we're going to break down people who are just maybes. Players I don't think are going to be drafted, but they deserve to be candidates for the possibles. And I have 4 players in mind specifically that I'll list out as we continue with Locked on HBCU. And as we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked on HBCU, thank you for making us your first listen of the day every day, making it all the way to segment 3. And I thank you 2 times for that. Now, these are players who I do not believe are going to be drafted. However, I do think they're going to be undrafted free agents that people are going to pick up. This category is the deepest when it comes to the HBCU class. I actually think there's 11 to 13 players who, if their name were selected, I wouldn't be utterly shocked. I'd be surprised with a good amount of them, because a good amount of them I don't think are going to be drafted, right? But I wouldn't be utterly shocked. And no, that doesn't mean that in any way I believe 13 HBCU players are going to be drafted. It's just 13 individual names that if in some way were selected, I wouldn't be stunned or knocked out of my seat. Would be surprised, though. There's something I would be surprised about. And I'm not going to name any of those guys. But the 4 I chose to go with, and this is kind of Jackson State heavy, were Isaiah Bolden, Dejahn Warren, Dallas Daniels, and then Darius Hagans. Now, I want to compare the 2 defensive backs from Jackson State first, because I think that they're not going head-to-head. They're not competing for a last spot. But when you put them side by side, it's actually quite interesting how they compare to each other. Because Isaiah Bolden and Dejahn Warren, they didn't have overly productive defensive back careers at Jackson State. They really didn't. And they're actually very comparable with about 50 tackles over the course of 2.5 seasons, about 6 and 8 pass breakups. They're very comparable, but it's not an overly productive career as a defensive back. It's just not. But the path that they have after their Jackson State career, completely different to me. When I look at Warren, I look at a guy who I wasn't really satisfied with Warren's HBCU Legacy Bowl one-on-one reps. I got to New Orleans and I was able to talk to some people, and it seemed like a couple of them weren't really, they were on my side. They weren't really too excited with what he was doing. I don't know if he had the best postseason. I don't know if his best offseason was ahead of him. However, one thing that he has working for him is he's Dejahn Warren, a JUCO All-American, #1 junior college recruit coming out of his first 2 or after his first 2 years. And you're looking at a player who was committed to Georgia, but then decided to go to Jackson State. He has a lot of acclaim around him, and that's the kind of player that people pick up in the later rounds. Oh, man, you know what this guy was. We can just tap into his potential. I've seen it. You'll see it this year. If you pay attention enough, and most people don't, because most people check out. Once you get past the first 2 days, so that's round 1, 2, and 3, you might be around for the 4th round. But most people, they're not. Most people just are not around for the 4th round, or past the 4th round. So you'll see a lot of guys who, we can work with that. We can work with this. We can work with that. Remember who he was? Man, if we can just get him to reach his potential. That's Dejahn Warren. That's Dejahn Warren to me. But you look at Isaiah Bolden, he didn't have a lot of great defensive back production, but he did have elite level kick returning production. And he does have elite level pro day numbers. Let me read off his pro day. 4.31 for the 40, 38-inch vertical. You have a 10.9 broad jump. This is a great postseason stretch. He went to the Shrine Bowl, had a pretty good Shrine Bowl. This was a guy who I think since he's left Jackson State has been on a major run, and one that would really, I think this is one that could get him drafted. He's another one of those players who is a leading candidate for that possible category. Remember when I opened up at the very beginning and I said I got 5 with a possible, but I could really go 6, 7, but I didn't want to go too much leeway for myself? The players I was thinking about with 6 and 7 were Shaq Davis and Isaiah Bolden. I think that those are the 2 players who, man, I can't have confidence. And I actually think that Bolden's going to be a UDFA, that makes somebody roster, but it wouldn't shock me at all. I really bounced between putting him in this category and the category before, but I wanted to compare him and Warren because I just wonder who are they going to value more? The kick returner who has elite level testing, or are they going to value the guy who they felt like was once committed to Georgia and we can bring that potential out of him? Then in Jackson State again, to my Dallas Daniels on the wide receiver position. And he had a good Shrine Bowl, just like Isaiah Bolden did. He was a part of that high-powered offense, and I thought that Daniels looked amazing during the season. I just think he's going to be a UDFA guy. And not everybody agrees. That's not an opinion I think people share. A lot of people have their wide receiver rankings go Jadakis Bonds, Shaq Davis, Dallas Daniels, then Xavier Smith. Me personally, I have Jadakis Bonds, Xavier Smith, 1A, 1B. They're really tied for me. But Dallas Daniels is a wide receiver who's really talented in his own right? He doesn't have the same kick returning interest from teams that Xavier Smith has had, but I think that this isn't a comparison first off, but I think that he's had enough. He looked good in the Shrine Bowl. He was one of the better wide receivers in the Shrine Bowl, in my opinion. So, yeah, I think that it wouldn't shock me if he was drafted, but I do think he'll be a UDFA. And then lastly, Darius Hagans. And remember, I could have went a bunch of people. I just chose not to list a bunch of people. And I chose Hagans because if we're talking about NFLPA Bowl Hagans, this guy might be a 6th, 7th round pick. That's what it seemed like coming out of that game. But since then, and I was able to touch down in the Legacy Bowl and talk to who I believe to be a reliable source, and they told me the NFL scouts did not have much interest in the running backs at the Legacy Bowl. Emmanuel Wilson was there. Darius Hagans was there. just seem to not have a lot of interest in those players. So that's what I wanted to bring to you. I wanted to say a player who had a lot of talent. He was able to bring himself into one of the 3 premier pre-draft bowls. He played well in that bowl game, was highlighted as, I believe, either the most versatile or the most complete running back in that game. But I'm still just not certain. I don't think he's going to get drafted. I think he's going to be a UDFA, but I'll put him in my maybe category. So to wrap it all up, I have 5 players who I believe are going to be drafted. Mark Evans, Isaiah Land, Aubrey Miller, Xavier Smith, Jadakis Bonds, but I do have room for a possible. And the 2 leading candidates for that are Shaq Davis and Isaiah Bolden. Now, in tomorrow's episode, we're going to move it forward. We're going to have draft breakdowns, and I'm going to do this for the first time. I've never been in a scouting position. I've never done something like that, but I'm going to do a draft player or player profile, essentially, of my own. Not just basing it off of the Draft HBCU book, which you should be purchasing. So in the meantime, in between time, you're going to have to wait. But on tomorrow, we're going to bring that to you. I'm excited. You're going to kind of go through the first time with me. But in the meantime, in between time, if you're looking for me, you can find me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care. Stay blessed. Peace.